Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about drifting towards disunion, 1854 to 1861. Remember in the last chapter, it ended with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which will basically end all future hope or possibility of compromise between the North and the South with the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe will publish a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, whose intent was to show the cruelty of slavery. The roots of Harriet Beecher Stowe's anti-slavery sentiments laid in the evangelical religious revivals of the Second Great Awakening. She will only go to Kentucky in the Upper South. It will be her only trip into the South to view slavery firsthand. But as a result of reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, many Northerners swore that they would have nothing to do with the enforcement of the fugitive slave law. Probably no other novel in American history, perhaps in all history, can be compared with it as a political force. Several hundred thousand will be published in its first year of publication in 1852, and soon millions will be published in many different languages. And to millions of people, it made slavery appear almost as evil as it really was. And when Harriet Beecher Stowe was introduced to Abraham Lincoln in 1862, he replied to her, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." The impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin will not be felt just in the United States, but when the people of Britain and France read Uncle Tom's Cabin, their governments realized that intervention in the Civil War on behalf of the South would not be popular. The reality was that it basically divided their country's population into the pro-Northern working class and the pro-South aristocracy and ruling elite. Another book published by a Southerner was Hinton R. Helper's book, The Impending Crisis of the South. He will not find a publisher in the South, but it will only be published when he gets a Northern publishing house to do so. And it contended that slavery deeply harmed the poor whites or non-slave owning Southern whites of the South. And the uproar it caused in the South was so intense that he will have to move to the North. In 1855, pro-slavery Southerners regarded Kansas as slave territory, but few pro-Southern Kansas pioneers brought a large number of slaves with them in order to guarantee that Kansas would not become a free state. In fact, there would only be 5 there in Kansas and only 15 in the Nebraska Territory. The violence in Kansas was provoked by both radical abolitionists and militant pro-slavery forces. In Bleeding Kansas in the mid-1850s, the Lecompton Constitution was identified with the pro-slavery element, and the New England Immigrant Aid Society was associated with the anti-slavery Free Soilers who were armed with Beecher's Bibles, Sharp's 50 caliber rifles. In 1856, the breaking point over slavery in Kansas came with an attack on Lawrence, on the free town of Lawrence by a gang of pro-slavery raiders. And the Lecompton also in 1856, after this raid, we have John Brown first come to prominence, national prominence, when he and his sons will kill 5 pro-slavery supporters at Pottawatomie Creek in retaliation for that pro-slavery raid on the town of Lawrence. A year later, the Lecompton Constitution will be proposed. It was written so that Kansas would continue to permit slavery in some form. The Lecompton Constitution proposed that the state of Kansas would have black bondage regardless of whether the document was approved or not. The problem of the Lecompton Constitution was that it will hopelessly split the Democrats even more after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. President James Buchanan's decision on to support the Lecompton Constitution when it will be presented before Congress will hopelessly divide that party when Stephen A. Douglas will come out in opposition to it. Remember, he is an advocate of popular sovereignty. The reality is that the situation in Kansas in the mid-1850s indicated the impracticality of popular sovereignty. In the same year, in Congress, we have an infamous incident occurred between Preston S. Brooks, a representative from South Carolina, and Charles Sumner, the virulent anti-slavery senator from Massachusetts. After Charles Sumner had made an inflamed speech in the Senate after the attack and situation in Kansas, when he alluded to the senator from South Carolina, who was very popular, his distant cousin, Preston S. Brooks, will enter the Senate chamber and approach Charles Sumner at his desk, and he will beat him senselessly with a cane. This clash or incident between Preston S. Brooks and Charles Sumner in the halls of Congress revealed passions over slavery were becoming dangerously inflamed in both the North and the South. Both South Carolina and Massachusetts defiantly re-elected the principal figures in this beating incident. In fact, Charles Sumner's seat will be left empty for 3.5 years while he will recover from his serious wounds given to him by Preston S. Brooks. And because he broke his walking stick or his cane in this incident, Preston S. Brooks, who will resign from Congress Congress and the House will not be able to impeach him, he will resign and he will receive hundreds of replacement canes in the mail. In the election of 1856, we have the Democrats hopelessly divided over the issue of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the only reason that James Buchanan from Pennsylvania will win the Democratic nomination is because he had been out of the country as a U.S. ambassador to England during its passage. The Republicans, they will meet for the first time. Remember, they were organized in reaction to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They will be a solely northern or sectional party. They are not a national party like the Democratic Party. And they will nominate John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder. A third element of the election of 1856 will be a third party. The American Party, or the Know Nothing Party, developed as a result of the breakup of the Whig Party. It developed because of the idea that immigrants were responsible for rising crime and rates, and the belief that Catholics were against reform and controlled by the Pope. The central plank of the Know Nothing or American Party in the 1856 election was nativism, and they will nominate former President Millard Fillmore as their candidate. The real significance of the election of 1856 was that it foreshadowed an ominous sectional class over slavery in the election that would come in 1860. The Republicans will reveal astonishing strength for a brand new party in the North, even though they will lose the states of Pennsylvania and Indiana and Illinois, who had a large sympathetic population to the South in slavery. And the real reason that they lost the war is that the South threatened that if the Republicans won the White House in 1856, it would be a declaration of war. So as late as 1856, many Northerners were still willing to vote Democrat instead of Republican because they did not want to lose their profitable business connections with the South. 2 days after James Buchanan takes the oath of office, the Supreme Court will issue a landmark decision in Dred Scott versus Stanford. In this ruling, Dred Scott, who had been a slave to a U.S. officer, had lived extensively in free territory, and as a result, this was his basis for his bringing suit in federal court. And it had risen all the way to the Supreme Court, and Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, will lead the decision in 1857. In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was a slave, not a citizen of the United States, and therefore could not legally sue in a federal court. It also said that slaves were private property, and that since they were private property, according to the Fifth Amendment, persons could not be deprived of their slaves. They believed that Congress and territorial governments had no power to ban slavery from a territory or anywhere, and that slave owners should have the right to bring their property and slaves anywhere. So it argued because that slaves were private property, slave owners could take their slaves into free or slave territories. And the final element or provisions of their decision was that Scott should be returned to slavery. So, in recap, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision that the protection of slavery was guaranteed in all the territories of the West because slaves were property, and Congress could not prohibit slavery in territories because property owners could not be deprived of their slaves, based on the Fifth Amendment. So they basically ruled that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional, even though it had been repealed with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Also, it declared that the Constitution protected slave owners' rights to property no matter where they resided. So for a majority of Northerners, the most outrageous part of the Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott case was that Congress had never had the power to prohibit slavery in any territory, and the Republicans considered this decision invalid and vowed to defy it. In 1857, there will be a panic that was caused by the inflation due to the influx of gold from Southern California, overstimulation in land and railroads, and overproduction of grain crops in the Midwest. As a result of the Panic of 1857, which did not hurt the South believed that cotton was king, and they believed that its economy was fundamentally stronger than that of the North. And as a result of the Panic of 1857, in the North, we have calls for higher protective tariffs and free homesteads. In 1858, we have the senatorial race in Illinois between Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant, and Abraham Lincoln. And the political career of Lincoln could be best described as largely a failure until he will join the Republican Party in 1854 after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he will have a meteoric rise within that party. A key issue in the Lincoln-Douglas debates was whether people of a territory could prohibit slavery in light of the Dred Scott decision. These debates will take place in several Illinois towns over a extended period, and basically the key issue that Stephen A. Douglas will be presented by Lincoln is whether popular sovereignty was a solution to the issue of slavery in the territories after the Dred Scott decision. Stephen A. Douglas argued in his Freeport Doctrine during the Lincoln Douglas debates that slavery could stay down if the people voted it down no matter what the Supreme Court said. And he basically argued that a territory and its legislature could keep slavery out of the territories by their actions. In the Lincoln Douglas debates, Lincoln will state that he believed that the black race was inferior but entitled to the same natural rights as white people. And in Peoria, he will give his view of what the Republican Party key tenets were. It included a moral opposition to slavery. The national government had the right to exclude slavery from the territories, and that the nation must eventually eliminate slavery. And because of the large population of former Southerners, poor white Southerners who had moved into Southern Illinois to escape the domination of the planter elite, the slaveocracy, there will be more Democratic congressmen in the Illinois legislature, and it's the legislature who now elects the U.S. senators. So as a result of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Douglas will defeat Lincoln for the Senate, but Lincoln will become a prominent national figure. In his raid on Harper's Ferry, which was in northern Virginia, the home of a federal arsenal, John Brown intended to call upon the slaves to rise up and carry out a slave rebellion and eventually establish a black free state. After initial success in capturing the federal arsenal that resulted in several deaths, he had not spread the word among the slave population that surrounded Harper's Ferry that he was doing this in their name, and nothing happened. And eventually, Robert E. Lee will lead a regiment, a brigade of U.S. soldiers, and they will surround John Brown's party, and eventually they will be killed or will be forced to surrender, including John Brown. After John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, the South concluded that the North was dominated by Brown-loving Republicans. And the South was particularly enraged by the John Brown affair because they believed Brown's violent abolitionist sentiments were shared by the whole North. And the reason why they believed that is on his trial, in which he is convicted of treason and eventually hanged. His execution saw Harriet Tubman praise Brown's support of freedom for slaves. Abolitionists and free soilers were outraged. Ralph Waldo Emerson and other Northerners held him as a martyr, much like Jesus, and Southerners wondered how they would stay in the Union, or could stay in the Union. And as a result of the John Brown raid on Harper's Ferry, all of the state militia in the South will now be organized and mobilized. Southerners were shocked in relation to John Brown's raid because of the extent of mourning in the North, the financial support for the Northern elite, and his attempt to incite slave rebellion, which, remember, was the great fear that the South and its slave owners had lived in since Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. The presidential election of 1860 will be a monumental election. It will see the Democratic Party split into two, with each faction nominating its own presidential candidate. The Northern wing will nominate Douglas. The Southern wing will nominate John C. Breckinridge from Kentucky, and a few who were fearful of secession and a breakup of the Union will form the Constitutional Union Party as a middle-of-the-road party that feared the breakup of the nation, and they will nominate John Bell. When the Republican Party met in Philadelphia for its National Party Convention, William Seward was the front runner, but he had many liabilities, and one of them was that he was an abolitionist who preached for the immediate abolition of slavery and the end of it, and he had made many enemies. So Lincoln will win the 1860 Republican Party presidential nomination, in part because he had made fewer enemies than the front runner William Seward, held a more moderate position on slavery than did the other contenders, which he basically said that slavery should not be allowed to expand into the newly acquired Western territories, and his egalitarian image would attract votes among farmers and workers. The Republican Party platform favored protected tariffs, construction of a transcontinental railroad, free homesteads, and the non-extension of slavery. But the reality is the Republican Party was a sectional party. It was a northern party. So Lincoln will win the presidency with an electoral majority derived only from the North. In fact, in the election of 1860, Lincoln was not even on the ballot in 10 slave states. The only northern state Lincoln failed to win was New Jersey, which he split with Stephen A. Douglas, and the Republicans won with support in only one section of the country. So in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln won a majority in the Electoral College, 180, but he won less than a majority of the popular vote, only 39 or 40%. So when Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election, people in South Carolina rejoiced because it now gave them an excuse to secede. Southerners feared Lincoln's election to the presidency mainly because they knew he regarded slavery as morally wrong and would seek to unite Northern society against the slave power. The lame duck President James Buchanan believed that the Constitution did not authorize him to force Southern states to stay in the Union. So during the lame duck period, which was very long at this time in U.S. history, from November to March, Buchanan's indecisiveness paralyzed the North as the Southern secessionist movement gained momentum. Reasons why James Buchanan declined to use force to keep the South in Union was, number one, Northern public opinion would not support it. The Army was needed to control Indians in the West. Also, he was surrounded by pro-Southern advisors. In reality, even though he's from Pennsylvania, he is a Southern sympathizer, and there was a slim chance of reconciliation. So within 2 months after the election of Lincoln, 7 Southern states had seceded and formed the Confederate States of America. The ones who will secede are the ones from the deep South, South Carolina to Texas. In the last minutes or weeks before Lincoln's inauguration, John C. Crittenden, who is from Kentucky, will propose the Crittenden Compromise. It would revive the 3630 boundary line that had been established with the Missouri Compromise, but remember had been repealed and had become non-existent because of the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Crittenden Compromise would have prohibited slavery north of the 3630 parallel, but would have guaranteed federal protection of slavery in territories south of the 3630 parallel. So in other words, the Crittenden Compromise permitted the expansion of slavery into the new territory south of the 3630 parallel. Lincoln rejected the proposed Crittenden Compromise because it permitted the further extension of slavery south of this line into the territories. And because he rejected the Crittenden Compromise, This will end the last hopes of a peaceable sectional settlement and an end to secession. The reason why Lincoln opposed the Crittenden Compromise was that he had been elected on a platform that opposed the extension of slavery. So why did secession happen in 1860, 1861? Secessionists supported leaving the Union because they were dismayed by the success of the Republican Party. They were tired of abolitionist attacks. They believed that the North would not oppose their departure, and that the political balance seemed to be tipping against them if they remained into the Union. And secession came earlier in southern states with the highest concentration of slaves, in other words, the Black Belt, from South Carolina to Texas. In declaring their independence, the Confederate States relied heavily on the example of the principles of self-determination of the Declaration of Independence. Another motivating factor is the immense debt owed to Northern creditors by the South would be repudiated by Southern secession. So Southerners in the secession movement regarded their region as a subnation with a distinct culture from the North. Secessionists were inspired by worldwide impulses of nationalism. They resented being lorded over by the North, and they saw parallels between their movement and the 1776 break with England by the American colonists.